The day Lina Moretti's life crumbled began with a broken bouquet order and ended with 6 men in charcoal suits entering her flower studio like agents from a secret government. She was elbow-deep in baby's breath when one of them stepped forward and said in a tone as bland as it was menacing, "Ms. Moretti, Mr. Alastair Cordova would like a word." Her heart stuttered. Everyone in Miami knew that name. Alastair Cordova, real estate magnate, tech investor, and rumored crime-adjacent kingmaker. A man with more power than some city mayors. A man who never asked for anything. He simply summoned it. "I'm busy," Lina replied, clutching the pruning shears tighter than necessary. "Tell Mr. Cordova to make an appointment. This isn't a request." 15 minutes later, she was in the glass and marble tower of Cordova Holdings, staring out over Biscayne Bay. The skyline shimmered in the midday heat. Lina didn't feel the sun. She only felt dread. The office was cathedral-like in scale. Cold, pristine. And at its heart, facing away from her, stood a man in a dark suit, hands clasped behind his back, like a general surveying his empire. When he finally spoke, his voice was smooth velvet pulled tight over steel. "Your fiancé vanished with $250,000 of my money. Unfortunately for you, he used your name on the application." Lina swallowed. She should have known something was off when Rico started dressing better. When the business's books stopped adding up. She hadn't just been betrayed, she'd been used. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "He told me it was an investor loan." "I'm the investor," he said, finally turning. Alastair Cordova was both more and less than she expected. Striking in that way certain men are, where elegance masks danger. Sharp eyes, a ruthless mouth, the kind of presence that would make oxygen step aside. And now you're liable. That makes this messy. Lina lifted her chin even though her stomach twisted. "So you called me here to threaten me?" "No," he replied. "I called you here to make you an offer." He moved behind his desk and opened a leather folder. Inside were documents with her name, her family's names, her sister's medical expenses, her father's failing fruit farm in upstate New York. "You've got people depending on you. So I'll be clear." He snapped the folder shut. "Option 1, I call in your debt. Your shop goes under. Your credit tanks. Lawsuits follow." "Option 2, she asked bitterly. Alistair leaned back as if he were asking her what wine she preferred with her ruin. "You marry me." The room fell into silence. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You become my wife. For a year. Publicly. Legally. No emotions. No entanglements. Just signatures, smiles, and photo ops." "Why?" "My grandfather is dying. His shares, 30%, will revert to charity unless I'm married by his birthday. In 3 weeks. I need those shares to keep the board in line." Lina blinked at him. "And you just decided I'd do?" He smirked. "You're beautiful enough to be believable, unknown enough to be clean. More importantly," he leaned forward, "you're desperate." The word slapped her harder than if he'd raised a hand. Lina stood. "I may be many things, Mr. Cordova, but I'm not desperate." "You're proud," he corrected. "But pride won't pay for your sister's treatment. Or keep your shop from getting bulldozed." She turned to leave. "Wait," he said, his voice sharp now. "What if I sweeten the offer?" She paused. "You agree to this, 1 year, no strings, and I'll not only forgive the debt, I'll cede your shop $100,000. And I'll fund any personal project you choose. Anything. Anything within reason. Then I want you to fund a therapeutic garden project at Mercer Shelter," she said. "It's on land your company just bought. And you're planning to turn it into a parking structure." Alastair's expression flickered. Then he gave the faintest nod of approval. "You're not afraid to ask for what matters. I respect that." He extended his hand. "Do we have a deal, Ms. Moretti?" Lina looked at his hand. This man was a predator. No question. But he was offering her a deal with real teeth. Real salvation. And she'd survived worse than sharks in a tailored suit. "Fine," she said, shaking his hand. "But don't expect me to fall for you." "Oh," he murmured. "I expect nothing. But let's be clear, you belong to me now." She didn't flinch. But as she walked out of that office, she couldn't shake the strange look in his eyes. Not victory. Not cruelty. Curiosity. He wasn't just buying a fake wife. He was hunting for something. And neither of them was ready for what they were about to find in each other. 3 days into her agreement with Alastair Cordova, Lina Moretti found herself in a luxury high-rise she didn't belong in, reading from a script she hadn't written, about a relationship that had never existed. "We met at a charity gala," she recited, flipping through the binder he'd given her. "You were auctioning off a private dinner on your yacht for some cancer research initiative. I bid to win." "Because you're philanthropic and impulsive," Alistair replied from behind his desk. "You spilled wine on my tuxedo. I offered to buy you a new dress." Lina groaned. "You can't be serious." "It's believable," he said, standing and walking around the desk. "Elegant meet cute. Plenty of photo ops. It's absurd. No one who knows me would believe I've ever stepped foot on a yacht." He gave a tight smile. "That's why it's brilliant. No one knows you." He handed her a tablet. "Photoshop timeline. Chat logs. Fake plane tickets. We've built 6 months of romantic fiction. All you have to do is memorize your lines." She stared at the screen in disbelief. "Do all your business transactions come with costume changes and fake love stories?" "Only the ones worth $30 million in shareholder votes," he said. Lina flipped the tablet back onto the table. "I can't act. I once played a potato in 3rd grade and still got booed off stage." "Then we rehearse," he said simply. And without warning, without permission, he stepped close, tilted her chin up, and dropped his voice to a low murmur. "Lina, from the moment I saw you, I knew you were different. You challenged me. You made me want to be better. For the first time in my life, I imagined forever." His eyes burned into hers. His voice was intimate, tender. But it felt dangerously real. For one heartbeat, Lina forgot the rules of the arrangement. Forgot the script. She stepped back, shaking her head. "You really are good at this," she whispered. "It's not about being good," he said, the softness gone. "It's about being convincing." The next day, Lina stood in front of a floor-length mirror wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than her entire apartment. Emerald silk. Eye slit. Bare shoulders. A look carefully curated to impress a dying patriarch and a skeptical high society mother. Alastair's voice came from behind her. "You look passable." "You're a terrible liar," she muttered. "I don't lie. I sell illusions." "Is that what you told your grandfather too?" Alastair's face darkened. "Leave my grandfather out of this." He handed her a velvet box. Inside was a diamond ring the size of a glacier. "A bit much?" she asked. "Exactly what they'd expect me to buy," he replied, sliding it onto her finger. "It needs to be seen from across a ballroom." Lina stared at the sparkling lie on her hand. "Heavy. Cold. Beautiful. You sure you want to go through with this? You already signed the NDA and prenup. You're in this now, Ms. Moretti. You know you could have found a model or an actress, right? Someone who knows how to smile and not talk back." "That's precisely why I chose you," Alistair murmured. "You don't know how to pretend. That makes it believable." The Cordova family estate looked like a Tuscan villa had been surgically grafted onto the edge of Coral Gables. Ornate stone. Sculpted hedges. Staff that moved like trained ballet. Lina's nerves nearly buckled as they walked through the grand archway. "Remember," Alistair whispered as he took her hand. "My grandfather sees through everything. Stick to the story. Smile. And try not to look like you're plotting my death." "I make no promises," she replied. Inside the sunlit salon, 3 people turned to greet them. First, a tall, elegant woman with polished cheekbones and a platinum bob. Her handshake was firm, her smile calculating. "So this is the florist who's stolen my son's heart," she said. "Mother," Alistair said tight-lipped. "This is Lina." Next, an older man, warm, rotund, with a glass of whiskey in one hand, gave her a cheerful grin. "I'm Ronan," he said. "Alistair's stepfather. Don't worry, I've had 3 wives. You'll do fine." And finally, the kingmaker himself. Seated in a wingback chair, a blanket across his knees, was Ambrose Cordova, the man who built the empire Alistair now ruled. His eyes were sharp. Too sharp for someone so frail. "Come closer, girl," Ambrose rasped. "Let me see what kind of lie my grandson's selling today." Lina hesitated. Alistair tensed. She stepped forward. Ambrose took her hand. Squeezed. "Not gently. Tell me how you two met." Lina opened her mouth to recite the script. But something in the old man's gaze made her stop. He didn't want the fairy tale. He wanted the mess. So she told him a new version. "We didn't meet at a gala," she said. "He tried to demolish the building my shop was in. I called him a corporate parasite. He called me a liability. It was love at first insult." Pause. Then Ambrose laughed. A deep, gravelly sound that shook the room. "Now that," he said, pointing at her, "I believe." Alistair looked at her like she'd just set fire to a multi-million-dollar contract. But Lina saw it then, the glint in his eyes. Admiration. Later, in the garden, as champagne flowed and string lights glowed, Lina found herself alone with Alistair under a canopy of wisteria. "You just threw out 6 weeks of strategy," he said quietly. "I gave them something better," she said. The truth, dressed in sarcasm. "You could have blown everything. But I didn't," she whispered. "Because deep down, they saw it. They saw us." He didn't respond. Instead, he reached for her hand and slowly traced his thumb over her knuckles. "You're dangerous," he murmured. "You started it. You improvised. So did you. That orchid story? That wasn't in the binder." His mouth twitched. "It wasn't a story," he said. "I really did bring you a damaged orchid." "What?" "You just didn't notice. It was delivered anonymously." Lina felt her heart flutter. A mistake. This was a lie. A well-funded, perfectly executed lie. So why was her heart betraying her? Lina Moretti had never played make-believe so convincingly in her life. But what disturbed her most was that she had stopped playing. The days after the family dinner blurred into a cascade of wedding preparations. Tastings, fittings, floral choices, each detail meticulously curated by Alastair's army of professionals. Lina floated through it all, the eye of a perfectly controlled storm. And yet, somewhere between pretending to be in love and rehearsing kisses for cameras, she began to lose track of where the performance ended, and where something frighteningly real began. Alastair's penthouse felt like a high-end prison. Spacious, sterile, curated for optics. Lina had been given her own room, but he'd stopped knocking on her door after the second night. He didn't need to. She found herself drifting into his orbit. Not because she was required to, but because her body kept betraying her. Seeking the sound of his voice. The unspoken tension when their fingers brushed. The gentleness he slipped into when no one else was watching. One evening, while reviewing a mock guest list with Vivian, the wedding coordinator from hell, Alistair appeared in the doorway. "You're needed," he said, interrupting without apology. "For what?" Lina asked. "Come with me." That was all. No explanations. No context. 10 minutes later, they were driving down Ocean Drive in his black Aston Martin, the city lights reflecting off the windshield in blurred streaks. "Where are we going?" she asked, arms crossed. "To meet someone." "Is this another staged photo op? Should I look longingly at your jawline for the paparazzi?" He gave a soft exhale that might have been a laugh. "It's personal." She turned. That word wasn't in his vocabulary. They drove in silence until the city thinned out into winding roads bordered by palm trees and privacy hedges. Eventually, the car pulled into a gated estate, a Mediterranean-style property crumbling at the edges. Alistair led her out into the courtyard, where a dry fountain stood surrounded by overgrown bougainvillea and cracked tiles. "I haven't been here in years," he said, his voice lower than usual. "It was my mother's." Lina turned to him. "I thought she passed when you were a teen?" She did. This was her project. A wellness retreat. Garden therapy. Mindfulness. She called it her soul space. "Why bring me here?" He looked at her then. Not like a man evaluating a contract, but like someone who had nothing to hide for the first time. "Because you asked me to fund a community garden for strangers," he said. "And she spent her whole life trying to build spaces like that for people no one else cared about." Lina's throat tightened. "You never talk about her. Talking invites softness. Softness invites weakness. Or maybe it invites healing." They stood there in silence for a long time. Somewhere in the distance, crickets began to sing. "You could restore this," she said. "Turn it into what she dreamed it would be." "I don't have the time," he muttered. "But I do." He looked up. "Let me fix this place," she continued. "As part of our agreement. Forget PR. Forget the press. Let me do this, for her." She didn't expect the look that crossed his face. Raw. Unguarded. Vulnerable. "Okay," he said softly. Over the next 10 days something changed between them. Alistair no longer micromanaged her. He started appearing in the gardens after hours, shirt sleeves rolled up, dirt under his fingernails. She saw him sweat. Saw him curse when he dropped a clay pot. Saw him smile, not that perfect public smirk but something real and crooked and devastating. They worked side by side until twilight, often without words. And when they did speak, the conversations turned strange and startlingly personal. "What did you want to be before all of this?" he asked one evening, watching her transplant a climbing vine. A travel photographer. I wanted to wander and document forgotten places. But then my sister got sick, and I became the responsible one overnight. Funny, he said. I wanted to be invisible. She looked up, startled. I grew up under a microscope, he said. First the heir. Then the Cordova successor. Everyone wanted something. Money, favors, power. I just wanted to be left alone. And now you're orchestrating the most expensive fake wedding in South Florida. Life's funny that way. That weekend, Lina was sitting on the balcony of the penthouse, sketching garden redesigns, when Alistair joined her with 2 mugs of coffee. Did you just voluntarily bring caffeine to someone? She teased. Are you sick? Don't push your luck, he said, setting the cup beside her. I'm feeling generous. Generous enough to tell me why your grandfather insists on this marriage clause? He stared out at the skyline for a long moment before answering. Because he sees weakness in emotion, but loyalty and commitment. He believes marriage tempers arrogance. Does it? I don't know yet. Lina didn't realize she was leaning closer until she smelled the faintest trace of cedar and smoke from his skin. Familiar now. Comforting even. You don't talk like a man used to being touched. And you don't look at me like a woman pretending anymore. The silence that followed was thick with things neither dared to say. But it wasn't the moment that broke them. It was the knock. Vivian appeared with her usual breathless urgency. We have a problem. Of course they did. What now? Alistair asked, annoyed. The estate on Star Island you booked for the wedding? It's been double booked. A celebrity offered triple the fee. Find another venue, he ordered. Nothing's available in time, she replied. Unless. She hesitated. Unless we use your father's estate. Lina blinked. You have another estate? It's complicated, Alistair said. How? It's where my parents were married. Vivian chimed in. It's historic, stunning, private. But it hasn't been touched in over a decade. We'd have to restore everything in 2 weeks, Lina said. Can you? He asked. She hesitated, then nodded. With enough coffee? Yes. Alistair's eyes didn't leave hers. Then it's yours. Restoring the old Cordova estate became an obsession. Lina threw herself into it, summoning teams of landscapers, contractors, and volunteers. She revived the gardens, repainted the walls, scrubbed history into something hopeful. And Alistair? He showed up. Every single day. Not as a boss. As a man trying to make things right. They had lunch in the half-repaired greenhouse, barefoot dinners on the beach, and quiet nights where they lay on blankets beneath the stars and said nothing at all. But the most dangerous moments came in the small things. The way he started calling her Lina like it was a word made of silk. The way his fingers would brush her lower back when no one was looking. The way her pulse betrayed her every time he so much as looked in her direction. One night, after hours of hauling stones for a fountain restoration, she found herself sitting beside him, exhausted, sweaty, laughing uncontrollably at some ridiculous anecdote about a failed proposal he'd once orchestrated for a friend. You know, she said, wiping tears from her eyes, you're nothing like I expected. You either. You're worse, she teased. You're insufferable. You're arrogant. You're impossible. He kissed her. No warning. No pretense. Just lips against lips. A question and a confession all in one. And when Lina kissed him back, it was with the full weight of 1,000 what if she hadn't dared admit. When they pulled apart, breathless, everything changed. This isn't part of the contract, she whispered. No, he said, eyes locked to hers. It's not. But neither of them pulled away. The illusion had taken root. For a time it had even bloomed. Within the towering walls of Cordova Holdings and the stone-laced arches of the family estate, Lina Moretti and Alastair Cordova had learned to breathe the same rhythm. The boundaries between arrangement and affection had blurred like sea fog over Biscayne Bay, softening edges, distorting intentions, and tempting them both to believe the impossible. But illusions, no matter how exquisite, were always brittle. And cracks had begun to form. It began with a headline. Not a loud one. Not a screaming banner across the tabloids, but a discreet article buried inside a business blog known only to Miami's financial elite. An anonymous leak. One that detailed the exact conditions of Alastair's inheritance clause, that the shares held by Ambrose Cordova would be transferred only upon a legal, documented marriage, before his 86th birthday, and that the intended bride had appeared in Alastair's life only 6 days before the engagement was announced. The timing was damning. No names were mentioned, But Lina's face had already graced enough society photos, standing beside Alistair at ribbon cuttings, charity functions and garden restoration unveilings. The connections were too easy to draw. By morning, the story had been picked up by larger outlets, all asking the same question. Was Miami's most feared tycoon orchestrating a marriage of convenience to secure his empire? What had once been a private arrangement was now a ticking bomb. Inside the penthouse office at Cordova Tower, Alistair read the article in complete silence. Lina watched him from across the room, her arms folded tightly, the morning sunlight pouring across the marble floor like judgment. He didn't curse, didn't pace, didn't deny. He simply turned the screen to face her, and for a brief moment, something flickered behind his usual composure, a ghost of the boy she still didn't fully understand. Later that day, the Cordova family PR firm released a cold, strategic statement denying fabricated rumors, dismissing the blog as speculative noise from unreliable sources. But it was too late. The question had already rooted itself into the public imagination. And where questions took hold, ghosts followed. That evening, the ghosts arrived in the flesh. She appeared like a shadow, gliding into the private lounge during a press fundraiser hosted at the historic De Luna Gallery. Celia Marquette, a name Lina had never heard before, but one that rolled through the Cordova board members like thunder. Tall, blonde, glass-cut features and the kind of practiced smile that suggested she'd spent most of her adult life seducing power for sport. She didn't look at Lina immediately. No, she went straight for Alistair, greeting him with a kiss that lingered far too long for a man supposedly happily engaged. Lina felt it. The shift. The eyes in the room that suddenly redirected toward her. She stood perfectly still, fingers wrapped around a champagne flute she didn't drink from, wearing the expression of a woman who knew how to bleed quietly and elegantly. Celia's voice reached her a moment later. Silken. Weaponized. Oh, you must be Lina. Not Miss Moretti. Not the bride-to-be. Just Lina. As if her very presence had been a poorly kept secret. And just like that, the fantasy unraveled. Celia was more than a ghost. She had history. She had weight. She had memories of Alistair that Lina would never touch. She had once been his lover, and if whispers were to be believed, almost his wife. Rumors spread quickly, that Celia had left him at the altar, that she'd refused to sign a prenup, that she had once controlled a silent slice of Cordova's legacy, before vanishing into European fashion houses and dating tech moguls. But now, she was back. And her timing? Impeccable. Back at the penthouse, Lina didn't speak. She peeled off her earrings in silence, placed them on the marble counter, and sat by the window as the city glowed below in gold and neon. She felt like a prop. A perfectly arranged piece of stage dressing, waiting for instructions. Alistair joined her a few minutes later. He stood behind her, hands in his pockets, his reflection just barely visible in the darkened glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. I didn't know she was in town. Lina said nothing. Celia doesn't scare me, he added. She only ever loved the spotlight. Still, she didn't respond. Because it wasn't about fear. It was about something deeper. More human. A question she hadn't dared form until that moment. Was she the only one who had stopped pretending? She turned to him. Her eyes were steady even as her voice broke into a whisper. Tell me this isn't still just a game to you. Alistair blinked. A fraction of a second. But it was enough. He didn't answer quickly. And that was answer enough. That night, Lina didn't sleep in the penthouse. She took her sketchbook and her suitcase and slipped into a rideshare without announcing her destination. She went where her hands knew how to move, where silence didn't hurt so loud, the abandoned Cordova estate, where the garden project had become her anchor. She spent the night beneath the canopy of bougainvillea, pulling weeds in a cocktail dress, hands stained with soil and fury. Somewhere just before dawn, she curled into the hammock behind the greenhouse and let the ache in her chest finally dissolve into tears. What neither of them knew was that Ambrose Cordova had read the article too. The old man, still sharp in mind even if his heart beat unevenly, had recognized the storm building. He called for his attorney that very morning and made an amendment to his will, one that no one would see coming. Not even Alistair. Especially not Alistair. Because Ambrose had seen the writing on the wall. He had watched his grandson inch closer to something resembling love, and he knew that love could not thrive inside a contract. Not the kind they'd signed. If the empire was going to survive, it had to be earned through vulnerability. Through choice. Not coercion. By the next day the whispers had grown teeth. A viral thread on social media accused Lina of being a plant hired by Cordova Holdings to soften the company's image. Another influencer had posted a clip of her arriving at the Deluna event, timing it exactly with Celia's entrance. The edit was brutal. Lina looking small, Celia looking victorious, Alastair looking uncertain. The comments were cruel. She looks like a temp. He's clearly still in love with Celia. This whole thing screams tax maneuver. And then, one account leaked photos of the prenup agreement, blurred, yes, but real enough to validate the original leak. The story was no longer speculation. It was scandal. The morning was unusually quiet across the upper floors of Cordova Tower. The kind of silence that suggests something monumental has broken, but no one has yet found the courage to speak of it. Alistair stood at the edge of his office window, staring down at the city that once bent so easily to his will. Today it felt unrecognizable. Every high-rise he'd built, every signature scrawled across million-dollar contracts, none of it gave him the clarity he needed. Not now. Not since Lina had walked out. Across town, Lina Moretti sat cross-legged on a bench at the edge of the community garden she'd fought for, now a sunlit mosaic of green, restored with her bare hands in a wool no one saw coming. Children played nearby, chasing dragonflies. Volunteers trimmed herbs and rearranged planters. The place was alive. She was not. Her sketchbook lay open beside her, untouched. Because there were no blueprints for what to do when your chest felt like it had been hollowed out by a man you almost trusted. And worse, a man you had started to love. The night before, she discovered the truth not from a headline, not from a confrontation, not even from Alastair's mouth, but from a legal assistant with an apologetic smile and eyes that refused to meet hers. The assistant had come to deliver a supplemental clause, one that had apparently been added to the prenup weeks after Lina signed it. She hadn't been informed. She hadn't been asked. And that clause? It redefined the entire deal. If the marriage were to end before the one-year mark, by Lina's choosing, any funds promised to her, including the community garden endowment, would be retracted. Gone. Immediately. Without appeal. In other words, she had no escape clause. None that didn't come with the destruction of everything she had fought for. And it wasn't just about money. It was about the breach. The quiet betrayal tucked between sterile paragraphs of legalese. The way Alistair had handled her, even as she was beginning to believe he had seen her. She stared at the papers. Cold, precise, final. There was no signature beside the amendment. No need for one. It had been buried in an annex. Quiet. Surgical. It had been deliberate. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stood up, placed the document inside her bag and began to walk, out of the Cordova office, out of the life that had blurred too quickly into something intoxicating and unreal. For the first time in weeks, Lina returned to her modest studio apartment. Dust had settled across the countertop. The air smelled of absence. Her neighbor's dog barked through the wall like it used to. She exhaled. And then she did something she hadn't done since this all began. She sat down at her workbench. The orchid Alistair had once brought her still sat in the corner, wilted now but not beyond saving. Her hands moved instinctively, fingers steady as they removed the dried leaves, repotted the base, misted the roots. That's what Lina Moretti knew how to do. She salvaged broken things. The irony wasn't lost on her. Across the city, Alistair was unraveling. He canceled 3 meetings. Ignored 4 board calls. Spoke only in clipped sentences. Even Ambrose Cordova, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued despite the oxygen tube in his nose, noticed the difference. "You've finally broken something you can't buy your way out of," Ambrose said from his hospital suite. "Well done." Alistair didn't answer. He couldn't. Because for the first time in his life he had weaponized trust, accidentally or not, and used it against the one person who had never asked for anything from him that couldn't be grown or given with honesty. He opened his phone to a photo, one taken by a photographer at the gallery event weeks earlier. Lina had been laughing in the background, blurry but vibrant, the only person not looking at the camera. She hadn't known the photo was being taken. She hadn't posed. She had just existed beautifully. And now she was gone. Meanwhile, the media storm intensified. Lina's name trended for 3 straight days. Accusations swirled, claims of gold digging, emotional manipulation, professional fraud. Trolls filled her inbox with bile. But she didn't respond. She didn't defend. Because she knew the truth, and she had chosen to leave before it crushed her. Only one person reached out who mattered. Ambrose. His voice came through cracked and breathy on the phone, but it was direct. "You and I both know my grandson's an idiot." She said nothing. "He's also in love with you." Which makes him twice the fool because he's still pretending that power and love are the same currency. She swallowed. If you're smart, Ambrose added, you'll burn that contract. Not to escape him, but so that if you ever come back, it won't be on his terms. He hung up. No goodbye. No apology. Just truth. That night, Lina lit a match. She stood in the alley behind her apartment, holding the amendment pages in trembling fingers. She didn't hesitate. The flame caught fast, ink curling, corners shriveling, until all that remained was ash and a name she no longer recognized herself under. Mrs. Cordova. The title had never fit her. Not like her real name did. Not like the dirt beneath her nails. Not like the heartbeat in her chest. The next morning she walked to the garden. She dug. She replanted. She didn't wear the ring. And when Alistair showed up later that week, standing behind the iron gate like a man who didn't know if he was welcome, he didn't speak. He just stood there, waiting, watching her hands in the soil, wanting what could no longer be bought, negotiated, or contracted, only earned. The garden was quieter now. Its edges had been manicured, its beds vibrant with edible blooms and butterfly-attracting herbs. But the laughter had faded, and the energy that once pulsed through the dirt like electricity had dulled to something softer and sadder. Lina Moretti moved through the greenhouse like a ghost, quiet, methodical, deliberate. Every task she completed seemed to bleed a little ache from her bones. She tended each vine and planter with the attentiveness of someone holding a secret. Or perhaps, letting one go. It had been 11 days since she left the Cordova Tower. 11 days since she discovered the legal sabotage buried in the contract. 11 days since she walked away from a man who had taken everything she gave and twisted it into strategy. And in those 11 days she hadn't heard a single word from Alastair Cordova. Not one. The public didn't have the same restraint. The media storm had swelled into a tsunami. Some tabloids portrayed Lina as the wounded heroine, an outsider seduced by wealth and discarded when she got too close to the truth. Others painted her as the con artist, the fake philanthropist, the flower girl who had faked a love story to steal legacy and influence. It didn't help that Celia Marquette had begun giving interviews again. Strategic, subtle, always punctuated with phrases like, "Some people just aren't built for this world," and "True connections don't need contracts to prove themselves." Lina ignored every headline, every ping, every cruel DM. But each time she passed a newsstand or her phone buzzed with a mention, it reminded her that her name was no longer hers. It belonged to the public now, dragged through narrative after narrative like a flag in a war she hadn't agreed to fight. The only relief came from the work. She poured herself into the Mercer Garden project. 12-hour days in the sun, hauling soil, training new volunteers, designing meditation nooks along shaded stone paths. She repainted benches with her hands blistered. She planted a row of firewheel daisies in a circular pattern just for the children. Each task was an anchor. Each minute away from the past, a kind of rescue. And yet, every time her fingers dipped into the earth, her mind betrayed her. She remembered his hands beside hers as they'd once laid the first orchid bed at the estate. His shoulder brushing hers in the greenhouse. The night he sat beside her, wordless, as cicadas sang around them, and the quiet between them had felt like something sacred. And now that quiet was a chasm. Alistair, meanwhile, was unraveling behind closed doors. He still came to work. Still attended board meetings. Still wore the suit and the impenetrable expression. But beneath the armor, something had fractured. Something essential. His assistant noted it in small things. He stopped correcting typos. Forgot 2 investor calls. Missed a quarterly review entirely. He stopped drinking the espresso he once demanded every morning at precisely 7:15. And the penthouse? Dark. Unchanged. Her sketchbook still lay open on the sofa. The orchid she had nurtured had begun to wither again. Alistair stood over it one night, staring as the edges browned and curled. He didn't know how to fix plants. He only knew how to own them. And that realization haunted him. One morning, Ambrose Cordova requested his presence. The old man was fading. His body frilier now, voice more brittle. But his mind, as sharp as the knives he once metaphorically wielded in the boardroom. Alistair stood at the foot of the bed, hands behind his back, posture stiff. "Do you know what your problem is?" Ambrose asked, not waiting for permission to speak. "You think being seen is the same as being respected." Alistair frowned. "You built a fortress of glass and steel around your name. You made it untouchable. But it's also unlivable. That girl, Lina, she saw through it. And you panicked." Silence. "Did you love her?" the old man asked. It was the first time anyone had asked him that directly. Alistair didn't answer. Ambrose coughed, a deep, crackling sound. Then after a long pause, "You need to make a decision, boy. Either you let her go, or you go back and fight for her without all this." He gestured at the oxygen tank, the legal folders the Empire built from cruelty. "Burn the armor. Or die in it." That night, Alistair left the tower without his driver. He walked miles through Miami's sleepless streets, past the construction zones and the shuttered cafes and the neon signs flickering like dying stars. He found himself outside the gate of the Mercer Community Garden. It was closed, but he didn't move. He stood there until the sun began to bleed into the horizon, gold spilling between high rises. That's when he saw her. Through the wrought iron, bent over a soil bed, hair pinned up in that careless way she always wore it when she worked. She didn't see him. He didn't call out. He didn't knock. He just watched. And for the first time in weeks he felt something like reverence. She looked tired. And beautiful. And more herself than he had ever seen her inside his world. He had tried to fold her into his empire. But she had always belonged to something freer. Something growing. The next afternoon, a courier arrived at Lina's garden gate. A single package. No note. No return address. Inside was an envelope and a flash drive. The envelope held a letter in handwriting she didn't recognize. It was soft, slanted, ink smudged in the corners. It began. "My name was Lucia Cordova. But before that I was Lucia Reyes, the girl who used to plant wildflowers in forgotten fields and believed skyscrapers were cages. If you're reading this, then my son has given you something he never gave anyone else." His mother's last truth? Lina's breath caught. The letter continued, explaining how Alistair's mother had once owned the now derelict estate he'd shown Lina weeks ago. That she had dreamed of creating a retreat for trauma survivors. That she had wanted to use her inheritance not for business, but for healing. She had died before finishing it. And her son, Alistair, had buried her dreams with her, building over grief with ambition. Until Lina. The flash drive, Lina later discovered, held her original blueprints. Sketches. Handwritten notes. Pages filled with designs nearly identical to the garden layouts Lina had created on her own. Their minds had once dreamed the same sanctuary. It was late evening when she sat beneath the fig tree at the center of the garden. She stared at the sky. And for the first time in weeks, her tears came without bitterness. She cried not for what had ended, but for what might still be built, if both of them were willing to start again, not as pawns in a contract, but as two people ready to burn the script and rewrite their truth from the roots. For 5 days, Lina Moretti did not reply. She didn't send a message, didn't acknowledge the package, didn't respond to the 3 missed calls from a number she knew too well. Because the letter from Lucia Cordova, long dead and long silenced, had stirred something raw and precarious in her chest, something not even Alistair himself had managed to do. It made her believe again. In kindness, in legacy, in the idea that maybe love, real, unbought, unscripted, could grow out of wreckage. But belief was dangerous, and Lina was still bleeding. Meanwhile, across the city, Alastair Cordova was shedding his skin. He stopped attending board meetings, paused all media appearances, canceled a long-planned investor retreat in Aspen. Instead, he spent his days locked in his late mother's abandoned estate, alone. No assistants, no stylists, no agenda, just bricks, blueprints, and silence. Each morning he arrived before the sun. He pulled weeds with blistered hands, carried stone tiles across uneven paths, studied Lucia's journals, reading passages aloud into the echo of the main house like she might hear him. In one entry dated years before her death, Lucia had written, "I fear what he's becoming. They're shaping him into something I don't recognize. But maybe one day he'll meet someone who sees the boy I raised beneath the mask. And maybe then he'll find his way back." Alistair read it 3 times. Then he broke down. For the first time since her funeral, he wept. Alone. Unrestrained. Guttural. The kind of grief that tears through decades and defies language. He returned to the Mercer garden a week later. Not in a suit. Not in a car. He came alone. On foot. Dressed in jeans and a wrinkled cotton shirt, hands stained with dust and concrete. His eyes were tired. Softer. Unarmed. Lina was pruning a row of sage plants near the back wall when she saw him. He didn't speak at first. Just stood at the edge of the garden like a man approaching a shrine. When she turned to face him, he inhaled shakily. "I didn't come to explain," he said. "I came to confess." She said nothing. Not yet. What I did, that clause. I didn't draft it to hurt you. I drafted it before I knew who you were. Before I even believed you were real." His voice cracked at that word. Real. I was raised to anticipate betrayal. To write protections into everything. My grandfather taught me that loyalty ends where leverage begins. He stepped closer. Just enough that she could see the fatigue around his mouth. The cut on his palm. "But you never asked for leverage, Lina. Not once. You just wanted honesty. And I gave you control. But only after I buried the path back to trust beneath legal garbage." He paused. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to hear the part one never said." She folded her arms, voice low. "Why now?" Alistair looked down. Then back up, eyes filled with something raw. "Because I found my mother again. Through you." Silence stretched long between them. Then he held something out. A ring. But not the one he had given her months ago. Not the 6-carat diamond he'd chosen for visibility and press optics. This one was small, delicate, encased in twisted gold vines. "It was hers," he said. "The only thing I ever saw her wear that wasn't for a gala or fundraiser. She wore it when she was home. When she was gardening. When she was happy." Lina's throat tightened. He placed the ring on the bench between them. Not in her hand. Not with pressure. Just there. Waiting. "I don't want you back as my wife," he said softly. "I want you back as yourself. If there's a version of this story where I get to earn that, I'll wait." For hours after he left, Lina sat in the garden. She watched the children come and go. Watched the volunteers greet each other with joy. And then she looked at the ring. It didn't glitter like the other one. It wasn't meant to. It simply belonged. That night, Lina returned to her apartment and opened her sketchbook. She flipped past the pages of the garden. Past the estate restoration concepts. Until she reached a blank sheet. And there, slowly, tenderly, she began to draw. Not a building. Not a bouquet. But a pair of hands, dusty, worn, reaching across a growing vine toward a hand that was reaching back. Not holding. Not grabbing. Just reaching. With choice. With hope. With love. There are two kinds of returns. Those driven by necessity, and those born of transformation. Lina Moretti had lived through both. The first time she entered Alastair Cordova's world, she did so carrying the weight of debt, obligation, and wounded pride. She was forced to wear a smile like armor and speak the lines she'd been handed. A woman shaped by survival, not choice. But the second time? She returned as something far more dangerous. She returned as herself. It had been 16 days since Alistair had appeared at her garden with his mother's ring and a confession that had shaken her more than any scandal or secret. 16 days of thinking. Remembering. Watching the world spin on without her, and without him. 16 days of sorting through silence, until her feelings clarified into something frighteningly clear. She still loved him. Not for the empire. Not for the promise. But for the man who stood beneath the layers of legacy, beneath the architecture of pride. And if she was going to go back, it wouldn't be as a piece of furniture in someone else's story. She would walk through that door on her terms, or not at all. The Cordova estate had changed since she last stepped inside. Once sterile and palatial, it now bore quiet signs of renewal. Dust was gone from the corners. New flowers, her flowers, had been planted along the perimeter walls. The scent of lavender drifted through the foyer, where once only the cold polish of marble had lingered. She stood at the threshold of the garden courtyard, where the old stone fountain now flowed again, restored with creeping moss and quiet water lilies that nodded like sleepy witnesses to her return. And there he was, not waiting for her in a suit, not on a throne of control, but kneeling in the soil, sleeves rolled, hair tousled, mud streaked across one cheek like an accidental badge of surrender. He looked up, saw her, and froze. Their eyes met across the garden bed, and for a long, trembling moment, neither moved. Then wordlessly he stood. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she walked past him toward the bench beneath the olive tree, the same one she used to sketch from during long afternoons. She reached into her bag, removed the ring he had given her, not the diamond from their contract but his mother's heirloom. She placed it gently on the stone seat between them like setting down a seed. "You don't get to give me this," she said quietly, "and expect me to return as if nothing happened." He nodded once. No defensiveness. No denial. She continued. "But I've read her journals. And I've walked the estate. I've seen what she wanted this place to be. What she wanted you to become." Pause. "And for the first time I think maybe you're closer to being that man." The silence between them vibrated, no longer tense but reverent. "So I'm here," she said. "Not as your wife. Not as your employee. But as the woman who wants to help you finish what your mother started." "And after that?" he asked, barely breathing. Lina tilted her head. "After that, we figure out what we are, without contracts, without pressure, without timelines." Her voice caught. "Because if we're going to try again, it has to be as equals." Alistair's jaw clenched slightly, not from anger, but from the sheer restraint it took not to collapse forward and bury his face in her hands. "Then let's start there," he said hoarsely. He held out his hand, not for a shake, not for a kiss, just to hold. She looked at it, and took it. The days that followed felt nothing like the first chapter of their story. There were no press releases, no curated events, no obligations. Instead, there were sunrises shared over black coffee on the garden porch. Long hours restoring Lucia's greenhouse, piece by piece, each window pane polished, each shelf filled with herbs and heirloom seedlings. Evenings were spent beneath string lights, tangled in stories and quiet laughter. Nights passed with nothing more than two people falling asleep beside each other, no longer out of duty but out of peace. They were building something. Not out of guilt, not out of need, but out of reverence for the ruin they'd survived, and the future they dared now to imagine. But the world beyond their garden was not sleeping. The board at Cordova Holdings had grown restless. Celia Marquette's shadow still lingered in the corporate halls, feeding whispers that Alistair had become soft, distracted, vulnerable. An emergency board meeting was called. Rumors of a vote to replace him as CEO began to circulate like rot beneath polished wood. Alistair was notified while standing in the greenhouse, a call delivered with all the warmth of a guillotine. He didn't panic. Instead, he looked at Lina, who had paused mid-sketch. "It's time," he said. "For what?" she asked. "For me to stop protecting the Cordova legacy and start redefining it." He entered the boardroom that Friday not in the usual armor of power, but in humility. He brought documents, not of shareholder returns, but of impact statements, garden restoration blueprints, community projects, photos of children learning to plant for the first time, testimonials from veterans using the gardens for therapy, environmental recovery plans co-signed by Lina and the Mercer team. He laid them out on the table like a manifesto. "My mother didn't just leave me land. She left me vision. And I've spent most of my career running from it, until now." He paused. "I don't want to be your puppet CEO anymore. I want to lead this company into the next century, not with brute force but with purpose." Silence. "If you want someone to build fortresses, find another man. But if you want someone who can turn this empire into something meaningful, then I suggest you let me finish what I've started." There was a beat of stillness. Then, to everyone's surprise, Ambrose Cordova stood, slowly, frail, but with fire in his gaze. "Let the boy finish," the old man said. The room didn't dare disagree. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the palm skyline, Alistair found Lina once again at the olive bench, this time sketching two people planting trees together. Not buildings, not bouquets, just hands in soil, growing. He sat beside her, quiet, humble, grateful. "You're not my redemption arc," he whispered. She turned to him, smiling softly. "I'm not your savior either." "Then what are we?" "We're what's next." And then, without grandeur, without photographers, without anyone watching, she leaned in and kissed him. Not like a wife, not like a partner in a corporate contract, but like a woman choosing a man, not because she had to, but because he'd finally become someone worth choosing. It began with a file, encrypted, anonymous, delivered in the dead of night to every major news outlet in Miami, New York, and Los Angeles. By sunrise it had gone viral. #Cordova contract trended globally within 3 hours. Leaked emails, scanned documents. The original prenuptial agreement between Alastair Cordova and Lina Moretti, complete with the now infamous clause tying their marriage directly to a massive inheritance payout. Were still the addendum. The one Lina had discovered only after it was too late. The one that made her financial security, and her community garden, contingent on remaining married for a full calendar year. No context. No explanations. Just proof. And just like that, the world split them wide open again. Within hours, the headlines screamed. Cordova marriage confirmed as transactional. Love for sale? Florist turned fiancé at center of corporate scandal. He paid her to stay. She stayed until she didn't. The tabloids weren't merciful this time. They'd tasted blood before. Now they wanted carnage. They questioned Lina's integrity, her motives, her role in the charade. Paparazzi staked out her garden. Online threats poured in. Volunteers dropped out from fear of association. One mother pulled her son from a youth garden therapy program, claiming she wouldn't let her child be part of a media circus manipulated by a gold digger. The garden, the one safe place Lina had left, was suddenly a battlefield. And what made it worse? Lina hadn't even known the exposé was coming. She had gone to bed the night before curled in Alastair's arms, her heartbeat steady for the first time in months. They'd planted tomatoes that afternoon. They'd laughed. They'd kissed in the rain. And now, she woke up to betrayal crashing through the world they'd rebuilt. Again. Alastair's reaction was immediate, but not loud. No yelling. No chairs thrown. No damage to things that couldn't bleed. He simply stared at the headline on his phone screen, his jaw tight, eyes unreadable. "We locked those files in encrypted folders," he said slowly, his voice cold. "Only 4 people ever had access to them." Lina didn't answer. Not at first. Because what could she say? That the world now saw her worst fear realized? That everything she had tried to rebuild with him was once again reduced to a calculated exchange? She turned to him. And for the first time in weeks there was space between them. The kind that felt colder than any contract. Later that morning, Lina held a press conference outside the Mercer Garden gates. Not to defend herself. Not to spin the story. But to speak. To reclaim her name. "I did not marry Alastair Cordova for money," she said into the sea of microphones. "I married him to protect a legacy I didn't understand, and to survive a life that had cornered me. Yes, there was a contract. Yes, it was flawed. Yes, I walked away when I discovered it." A murmur moved through the crowd. But she didn't stop. What the contract never accounted for was that we would fall in love. She looked directly at the cameras now, no longer hiding. Not the love you write into legal clauses. Not the kind that fits neatly into a magazine spread. But the love that blooms from brokenness, from forgiveness, from choice. "I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm simply telling the truth." Then she stepped back. No dramatic exit. No tears. She turned and returned to the soil. But behind the scenes, the damage was deepening. Alastair's board panicked. Investors threatened to pull funding. Sponsors froze partnerships. Legal counsel advised silence, but Alastair ignored them. He refused to abandon Lina to the media wolves. Not again. Instead, he called a press conference of his own. One that would not be held in a boardroom, but at Lucia's restored greenhouse. The same one his mother had dreamed of. The same one Lina had rebuilt with her bare hands. He stood beneath the arch of blooming vines and faced a wall of reporters. "My name is Alastair Cordova. And yes, I wrote the contract. I built the walls. I manipulated the outcome. I protected the empire, but I destroyed the truth." He paused. Lina Moretti was never the liar in this story. I lied to myself. I told myself that love could be bought, that trust could be engineered. He looked around the garden. "This space, this sanctuary, is what she built from the ruins I left her. And if any of you still think she's the one pretending..." He gestured behind him to a mural now painted across the greenhouse wall. Lucia's original sketches combined with Lina's updated vision. 2 hands in the soil, vines twined between fingers. "Then maybe you've forgotten what real legacy looks like." Then he walked away. That night, Lina sat alone in her apartment. The noise was still out there, but quieter now. Muted. Her inbox had begun to fill with apologies. The woman who'd pulled her son from the program had written back, teary, remorseful, asking if he could return. But none of it mattered. Not yet. Because there was one thing still missing. At midnight, a knock came. Alistair stood in the hallway, soaked from the rain, not wearing a suit. Just jeans. A flannel. And a heart cracked wide open. He didn't speak. He just held out a folder. Inside it was a letter from Ambrose, dated and signed the day before the leak. In it, the old man acknowledged the contract had been wrong. He formally signed over his voting shares to Alistair, not because of the marriage but because of his transformation. The man Ambrose had once raised to be ruthless, had become something else. Because of her. "He gave me the company," Alistair said, voice hoarse. "Not because I earned it, but because I chose not to fight for it with blood this time." "So what are you going to do with it?" Lina asked. "I want to build something with you," he said. "Not for headlines. Not to prove anything. Just because I finally know what it means to build something that grows people, not just profits." He stepped closer. "I love you, Lina. Not because you fixed me, but because you refused to lie to me. You saw me broken and didn't look away." A long pause. "So now I'm asking you to look again." at who I am, at who we could be. She stared at him. And then, she opened the door. Not just the one to her apartment. The one to everything. The Cordova Tower had always stood like a monument, an exclamation mark on the Miami skyline. A glass and steel cathedral to power. Polished, cold, imposing. Just like the man who built it. But now, Alastair Cordova stood at the very top of that tower, staring out through the sweeping windows at the city he'd once owned. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel taller than it. He felt small. Not in defeat, but in clarity. The fallout from the exposé had settled into two brutal truths. 1. His empire could no longer operate the way it once had. 2. He no longer wanted it to. The board had lost confidence in him. Not because of financial incompetence, but because he'd revealed something they didn't know how to control. Humanity. He'd stood before the press, vulnerable and unguarded, defending a woman who'd once been viewed as a PR asset and now threatened to become the soul of a new era. Investors were rattled. Shareholders whispered. Old allies turned their backs. One by one, Alistair watched pillars of the old order disintegrate, and felt none of the panic he once would have. Because Lina hadn't just reopened his heart. She had reopened his vision. Back at the restored Cordova estate, now known publicly as the Lucia Foundation, Lina was facing her own reckoning. The garden had become a refuge again. Children had returned. Volunteers bloomed in number. But one visitor changed everything. She arrived quietly. No press. No entourage. Just a small woman with deep-set eyes and a floral scarf wrapped over her graying curls. "You don't know me," she said softly. "But I'm your aunt." Lina froze. "My mother's sister," the woman added. "We haven't spoken in years. Not since you were a child." Her name was Maribel, and her story was one Lina had never heard. Not because it had been hidden, but because no one had ever stayed long enough in Lina's life to tell it. They talked for hours, beneath the pergola in the far corner of the garden, where jasmine vines now curled like secrets waiting to bloom. Maribel spoke of Lina's mother, the woman who taught her to grow herbs for healing, who planted sunflowers every spring, who used to say, "Beauty should never ask for permission." Tears welled in Lina's eyes as she realized that her love for soil and sun and rebirth wasn't a rebellion. It was a legacy. That same night, Alistair returned home with a single box. Inside it were the last remaining contents of his Cordova Tower office. A plaque. A few ledgers. One expensive, untouched fountain pen. And a torn photograph. He set it on the kitchen counter, next to Lina's dried flower bundle. In the picture, a younger Alistair stood beside his mother, just outside the unfinished greenhouse. She was laughing. He was scowling. But the tension between them had been captured in something tender. His hands slightly behind hers, not quite touching, as if reaching without knowing how. Now, decades later, he understood. He'd been trying to hold on to a world that didn't know how to hold him. Until Lina. The next morning, Alistair formally resigned as CEO of Cordova Holdings. No media spectacle. No lawyers. He handed over the reins to a young, reform-minded executive he had quietly mentored. Someone who would protect the parts worth saving and dismantle the rot. In a closed-door meeting, he addressed the remaining board. "You built this tower with fire and fear. I built it with numbers. But the future will be built with roots." Then he left the room, unshackled. Lina found him hours later in the Olive Garden. He was barefoot, seated on the grass, poring over a weathered journal, Lucia's. He looked up when he sensed her, a rare smile softening his face. "It's done," he said. "You mean the empire?" He nodded. "The one that didn't know how to feel? Gone. And what now?" He closed the journal. "Now I build something that can breathe." Together, they stood beneath the blooming archway of the central garden, where a new plaque had just been installed. In honor of those who chose growth over control. Below it, two names. Lucia Reyes Cordova. Lina Moretti. Two women. Two visions. One purpose. That night, Lina returned to the greenhouse to finish a drawing she had started weeks before. This time it wasn't just vines or hands. It was a home. One surrounded by wildflowers. Built low and warm. With open doors, no gates, and windows that reached for the sun. Alistair came up behind her, arms sliding gently around her waist. "Is that us?" he asked. She smiled, brushing charcoal dust from her fingertips. "It's where we're going." The Cordova name had once moved through Miami like prophecy. A whisper of wealth. A warning. A promise of power. But now the Cordova legacy was quiet. Frail. Human. Ambrose Cordova was dying. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But slowly, like a great tree hollowing from within, its bark still strong while its center withered into memory. His doctors spoke in softened voices. His nurses in shorter shifts. Alistair visited daily now. No longer with reports or agendas, but with books, silence, and the occasional poorly told joke that made the old man cough in delight. But it was Lina he asked for. Not Alistair. She found Ambrose in the garden suite of a private hospice wing overlooking the sea, an opulent space made to feel like a sanctuary, even as death waited at the edge of every breath. He was thinner now, sharper. Like time had boiled him down to truth alone. Come closer, he rasped, voice low but clear. Lina obeyed, sitting beside him. You know, he said, I didn't like you. She raised an eyebrow. Not at first, he clarified. You were unpredictable. Emotional. Too uncontainable. I thought you'd ruin him. Lina smiled faintly. And now I know you saved him. A beat. And in some strange way, you saved me too. He reached for a leather-bound portfolio on the table. Trembling fingers. Thin skin. Lina helped him hold it. Inside were letters, dozens of them. These were written for my grandson, Ambrose said. Over the years. Never sent. Because I didn't know how to talk to a boy I'd been too busy grooming into a weapon. The letters were handwritten. Unfiltered. Some pages stained with age, others torn from legal pads and hotel stationery. In them, Ambrose had chronicled regrets. Fears. Memories of Lucia. One passage stood out. I taught Alistair how to dominate rooms, but never how to walk into one without armor. I raised him to be a king. What I should have raised was a man. Lina felt her throat tighten. He needs to read these, she whispered. Ambrose shook his head. No. He needs to know that I trust you with them. Then came the envelope. Smaller. Sealed in wax. Ambrose held it up. This, he said, is yours. She opened it carefully. Inside was a deed. And a short note, scrawled in a hand even shakier than the rest. To the one who taught my grandson how to grow, not just build. The estate is yours. No strings. No PR. Just soil, stone, and story. Make it hers again. Her hands trembled. I can't accept this. You already have, he replied. Every time you touched that land with care. Every time you refused to let it be just another piece of real estate. Why me? He chuckled. Soft. Faint. Because you're the only person in his life who ever taught him that legacy wasn't inherited. It was chosen. Later that evening, Lina stepped outside onto the terrace of the hospice suite. The sea air was cool. The sky fading into bruised lavender. Alistair stood there, arms folded, staring at the water like it owed him an answer. She slipped the deed into his hand. He opened it. And stilled. He gave it to you, he murmured. He gave it to us, she corrected. No, this wasn't a transaction. This was his way of saying you're the part of this family that he couldn't create, but somehow ended up needing. He folded the deed back into the envelope, hands shaking. Then he turned and pulled her into him, slow, desperate, reverent. They didn't speak. There was no need to. Not anymore. Ambrose Cordova passed 2 days later in his sleep. No pain. No spectacle. Just stillness. At his request, there was no grand funeral. No marble tomb. No mausoleum with his initials etched in gold. Instead, he was cremated. And his ashes scattered beneath the olive tree at the Lucia Foundation's garden. By Alistair and Lina together. Just the two of them. No photographers. No press. Only wind. Memory. And the promise of something still blooming. Back at the estate, Lina opened the last journal entry Ambrose had written, tucked inside one of the letters she hadn't read aloud. If you're reading this, it means I'm finally out of your way. Don't mourn me. I had my time. Now let the earth have yours. And if you ever doubt yourself again, remember, the most powerful thing I ever did with this family was step aside and make room for yours. The Cordova estate had always been a fortress, stone and silence, glass and power. But now, under Lina Moretti's quiet guidance, it was becoming something else entirely. Not a monument. Not a memory. A living sanctuary. 3 months had passed since Ambrose Cordova's death. 3 months since the deed to the estate had been placed in Lina's hands. No strings, no publicity, no demands for appearances or partnerships. It was hers. And yet, it never felt like ownership. It felt like inheritance of purpose. Where once the grounds were manicured for prestige, now they overflowed with intention. Rows of lavender for trauma recovery. Native grasses to restore the soil. Herbal paths designed by veterans and nurses to reduce anxiety. A sensory trail for neurodivergent children to explore barefoot. A shaded pergola transformed into an outdoor therapy space where widows could gather and speak without judgment. The old ballroom, once cold and echoing, now housed Lucia's library, a sunlight-drenched reading room lined with journals, wellness texts, and seed catalogs from all over the world. And beside it, an open gallery showcasing Lina's drawings, paired side by side with Lucia's originals. Mother and son, root and bloom. Alastair Cordova, no longer a CEO but still unmistakably a leader, moved through it all like a man reborn. He spent his mornings digging soil beside reformed convicts training in landscape therapy. His afternoons were given to apprentices, young men and women from the community who never imagined a place like this could be for them. And in the evenings, he returned to Lina. Not to escape the world, but to celebrate the one they were finally building together. One Saturday morning, Lina stood at the center of the West Field with a group of volunteers and placed a small hand-carved stone marker into the soil. Red. For what grows from grief. Beneath it, she planted a jacaranda sapling, a tree native to her late mother's village. Its blossoms would turn brilliant purple come spring. Unmissable. Alive. A legacy no camera could monetize. She stood back and let the tears come. Not from pain, but from peace. That night, under the soft canopy of hanging lanterns and open stars, Lina and Alistair sat at a long table surrounded by the people they'd nurtured, gardeners, survivors, artists, dreamers. Laughter rang out like bells. Cups clinked. A child danced barefoot between rows of tulips while an elder hummed a lullaby from a language Lina didn't know but somehow understood. It wasn't a gala. There were no gowns. No photographers. No stage toasts. Just community. Just family, the chosen kind. Later, after the crowd had thinned and the candles flickered low, Lina walked with Alistair to the edge of the orchard, where olive trees now swayed in the breeze. There, she took his hand and led him beneath the largest tree. "You know what this place reminds me of?" she asked. He shook his head. "Hope. The quiet kind. The kind that takes root before you even realize it." He turned to her fully. "You gave that to me." She smiled gently. "We gave it to each other." From his pocket, Alistair pulled out a folded sheet of paper. One. Faintly torn at the edges. It was his mother's final sketch, a garden maze shaped like a heart, open on all sides. He pointed to the note scribbled beneath it in her curling script. "A place where no one gets lost. Only found." "I want to build this next," he said. Lina reached for his hand. "Let's do it." And then, in that quiet space between dusk and moonrise, she knelt. Not to propose, but to plant. A single wild orchid. Right there beneath the olive tree where Ambrose rested. "For him?" Alistair asked softly. "For her," Lina replied. "For Lucia. And maybe, a little for me." As the roots took hold beneath her fingertips, Lina looked up at the estate, glowing faintly under the stars. No longer Cordova's kingdom. No longer a stage for wealth. It was something far more lasting. A haven. A love story. A garden that could outlive them both. It started on an ordinary Tuesday. Not Valentine's Day. Not a holiday. Just another sun-stained morning in the garden, the kind where wind moved through leaves like whispered encouragement. Lina Moretti was kneeling in the greenhouse, transplanting rows of butterfly milkweed, her hands covered in soil. A smudge of dirt streaked her cheek. The sleeves of her linen shirt were rolled to the elbow. She was humming, a tune she didn't even realize she'd memorized from Alistair's off-key humming the night before. Nearby, Alastair Cordova was fixing the irrigation lines, cursing at a stubborn valve and laughing under his breath when Lina offered sarcastic advice from across the trellises. This was their rhythm now. Or banters. Meals shared on the porch. Mornings filled with barefoot walks. Evenings wrapped in tangled limbs and open window laughter. No title, no pressure, just presence. And that's when Lina knew. She didn't want to keep waiting for the right time. There wasn't going to be a perfect setting or dramatic gesture. She already had what she needed. She had him, raw, rebuilt, choosing this life with her every day. So she went inside and began to plan. Not a show, not a performance. Just a question. And a truth. That evening, Alistair returned to the orchard late. He'd gone into the city for a planning meeting about a community hydroponics lab. When he stepped through the estate gate, twilight was already rolling in. Something was different. There were no guests. No lights strung up in the trees. No music. Just a soft glow from under the olive tree, their olive tree. Lina stood there barefoot in a simple pale dress, her curls unbound, wind tugging at the hem as if the earth itself couldn't bear to let her stand still. She held nothing. No ring box. No speech. Just her presence. When Alistair approached, she smiled, not nervously but knowingly. Like someone who had finally made peace with every chapter that came before this one. "Do you remember the first night I stood here?" she asked. "Of course," he said. "You were furious, exhausted, and beautiful. You didn't know what you were asking from me." "No. I only knew I needed you." A quiet pause. The kind that doesn't ache, but invites. Then Lina reached into her pocket and pulled out something small. A seed. Wrapped in linen. She placed it in his hand. "This is all I have," she whispered. "Not diamonds. Not documents. Not guarantees. Just a seed." He looked down at it, delicate, black still. "And what's it for?" "For planting, together." She stepped closer. "I want to build the rest of my life with you, Alistair. Not because I'm scared of the world or because I owe you anything, but because I've seen you now. The real you." Her voice trembled, but not with doubt. With magnitude. "Will you marry me again? For real this time? No clauses. No cameras. No grand inheritance. Just me." He looked at her. And in his eyes was the quiet, breathless awe of a man who had been offered everything he never believed he deserved. "Yes," he said, barely a whisper. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." She smiled, tears now trailing silently down her cheeks. "Good. Because I already told the jacaranda tree." They laughed, both of them raw and real and standing exactly where their first marriage should have begun. Then together they knelt in the soil and planted the seed. No rings. No vows. No audience. Just love. Planted in truth. Watered by grief. Blooming in the soft certainty of two people who had once built a lie, and learned to live inside the truth it became. There were no save the dates. No stylists. No press coverage. No aisle lined with petals arranged by interns trying to impress a headline. There wasn't even a wedding dress. Because this wedding didn't ask for perfection. It only asked for presence. Lina Moretti and Alastair Cordova married for the second time under a sky that had no filter. Just clouds moving slow and honest across a canvas of blue. It happened on a Sunday morning. They didn't tell anyone except a few who had earned the right to witness. Not because of bloodlines but because they had stayed when the story got hard. The olive tree stood tall in the center of the orchard, its branches curved like open arms. The jacaranda sapling beside it had begun to bud early, as if it knew this was the moment it had been planted for. No podium. No officiant with a practice speech. Just a circle. Chairs were mismatched, some pulled from the greenhouse cafe, others borrowed from garden workstations still dusted in soil. Children from the youth program sat cross-legged on woven mats. Elderly neighbors wore sun hats and smiles. The gardener who had helped Alistair dig his first honest trench stood quietly with his hands folded. Maribel, Lina's aunt, held a bouquet of wild herbs and baby's breath. And at the center of it all stood them. Lina wore a simple dress of pale ivory linen, the same one she'd worn the day she proposed. No makeup. No veil. Just a small locket around her neck, with a photo of her mother on one side, and Lucia Cordova on the other. Alistair wore a white button-up rolled to the elbows and tan trousers still damp at the cuffs from his morning walk through the dew-covered garden. And yet, somehow, they looked more royal than any wedding magazine could have captured. When the time came to speak, neither of them pulled out a written vow. Instead, Alistair stepped forward and took Lina's hands, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I married you once for protection. But today I marry you for peace. You are the stillness that taught me how to listen. The truth that taught me how to unlearn everything power once meant to me." He paused. "With you I don't need a kingdom. I just need mornings that begin in gardens and nights that end in your arms." Lina squeezed his hands, tears now painting soft trails down her cheeks. Then she spoke. "I never thought I'd love someone like you," she whispered. "A man born from steel and shadow. But I've seen you break. And I've seen you choose softness when no one asked you to." She leaned closer. "You built towers. But with me you planted roots. So today, I say yes. Not because I need you, but because I choose you." The wind moved softly through the trees, like an exhale. And then they kissed. A slow, reverent, grounding kiss. Not a climax. Not a spectacle. Just home. Afterward there was no formal reception. Just long wooden tables beneath string lights, set with mismatched china and garden-cut herbs in mason jars. People brought what they had. One guest brought baked lemon tarts. Another, homemade hibiscus tea. Someone played an old guitar while children ran through rows of lavender. And Lina and Alastair? They sat on a bench together, her head on his shoulder, his fingers tracing slow circles against her wrist. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. The world they were building no longer needed validation. It just needed care. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the lanterns still flickered like soft stars, they returned to the olive tree. A note had been tied to one of its branches. In Ambrose's handwriting. Kings fall. Gardens grow. You've chosen wisely. They held each other beneath that tree until the sky turned indigo and silence once again felt like a love letter. No contracts. No debts. No fear. Just two hearts. Rooted. Intertwined. And growing. A year later, the Cordova estate barely resembled the fortress it once was. The walls still stood, but now they were softened by ivy and humming with life. No longer a fortress. Now, a foundation. The Lucia Foundation had become more than a garden. It was a movement. What started as a single restorative sanctuary had grown into 7 locations across Florida, with 2 more in development across the southern U.S. Each location bore the same commitment to regeneration, compassion, and community. Schools sent students for hands-on environmental education. Hospitals partnered for trauma therapy. Cities petitioned to convert abandoned lots into micro-sanctuaries modeled after Lucia's vision. And at the center of it all stood Lina and Alastair Cordova. Not figureheads. Not founders in name only, but co-laborers. Present, grounded, still planting with their own hands. Lina now hosted seasonal workshops called Growing from Grief. She led journaling sessions beneath the olive tree. She taught design students how to draft landscapes that nurture, not dominate. Alistair spent his mornings in a modest office above the greenhouse, writing grant proposals, learning how to listen instead of direct. Even his former board had come around. Some called it redemption. Others whispered it was a miracle. But neither Lina nor Alastair cared for the headlines anymore. They only cared for the soil. Their bedrooms still had cracked windows from the storm that rolled through last September. They'd never fixed them. They liked how the wind moved through the curtains. Life was perfectly, beautifully imperfect. On the first anniversary of their real wedding, a letter arrived. Delivered by hand. No stamp. No return address. It was written in crisp pen on thick paper. From Lucia. Dated 3 months before her death. To my son and the woman I hope he one day finds. If you're reading this, it means my vision for this land has finally found its gardeners. I don't know your name, dear girl, but I know your heart. Because it would take a rare kind of courage to love a Cordova man honestly. To both of you, please don't make my legacy your finish line. Make it your beginning. Build beyond me. Break what needs to break. Love like it's your soil. And when the next generation asks you why you stayed when it was hard, tell them this. Because it was worth it. Lina folded the letter slowly. She placed it inside a frame and hung it above the garden porch, beside a photo of Lucia smiling with dirt on her hands. That night, under the fig tree by the main garden, Alastair poured 2 glasses of wine. You know, he said softly, this isn't what I imagined my legacy would look like. Good, Lina replied. Because it's better. Why? She leaned her head against his shoulder. Because it breathes. And just before they turned in for the night, Lina pressed a hand gently to her stomach. A secret. Not yet spoken. But already growing. 3 months later, a new tree was planted in the Lucia Foundation's orchard. A small plaque beneath it read, "For what comes next." No names. No fanfare. Just a seed. Just soil. Just love that had taken root. And would now grow in ways no one could yet imagine.
Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this story, please like and share so others can see it too. Also hit the subscription button and notification bell so you can be notified on our next release. Thank you for your support. God bless you.